Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Belly to Belly. And we're here today to talk about taxes and tariffs. Sounds exciting. Well, we're with great friend Sonia Kanjee from Bridge. How are you, Sonia?
I'm doing well. How are you, Bill?
I am wonderful. So, Bridge, as soon as I heard the name of your company, I was so excited because it's a brilliant name. So, would you mind just sharing a little bit about what Bridge does, just so our audience has context for your comments?
Yes. So I'm a US CPA and I am typically based in London and I work exclusively with non-US companies that are expanding into the US. So that could be a European limited entity that's selling directly to US customers or a European company that has set up a US subsidiary to operate in the market. And Bridge provides guidance to these cross-border structures through tax compliance, tax filings, sales tax advisory, transfer pricing, and cross-border tax planning. If your US entity becomes really profitable, you want to bring some cash back home, I can help you do that in the most tax efficient way possible. So anything tax, I can cover.
Brilliant. Cool. So I have to say that one of the most frequent questions I hear, and thankfully people aren't asking me because my expertise is not tax, but when I'm on a panel about US expansion, I hear the question of, sort of two parts. One is, when should I form my US legal entity, and which one, generally between LLC and Corp and maybe a B Corp or something, but which one should I form? So how do you help companies sort of navigate that sort of when and what to that process?
So the when is really, it's flexible. It depends on whether you have the budget to invest early and go in and start building momentum versus if you're a little bit more budget constrained, you want to have some demand in the US before you jump into the US market completely. So it really does depend on the founder and the brand itself. But usually I say start from abroad, sell into the US, and then in a normal world, that's what I would say. But things are changing daily. But start from Europe, start selling into the US, and once you have maybe $500,000 of sales from the US, then start thinking about a US entity, and then definitely by the time you hit $1 million of US, if you haven't set up a US entity, you're going to be scrambling to then get your structure in place. And then for non-US companies, there's usually two options that they need to consider. And one is the LLC structure, and the other is a C Corp. And I'd say in the past 6 to 8 weeks, I have met with many companies that have told me that they have heard that the LLC is the better choice. And when I ask them why they feel that, why they are thinking that way, they say, someone told me that the LLC is a better choice. And I really want to know who that someone is. I want names now
I,
because
I read it on Reddit.
because yes, for some people, an LLC is the better choice, but that's usually when you're a US person or a US founder living in the United States. An LLC would naturally be the right choice for you because you're already filing US tax returns, and the LLC kind of flows into your personal tax filings and then it gets reported. But as a non US company, 9.999 out of 10 times, the correct choice is a C corporation. And the reason for that is because an LLC owned by one member owner, so if one person sets up a sole LLC, that is treated as a disregarded entity, which means it's a flow through entity. So anything the LLC does for tax purposes, the person that owns the LLC has to report it, which is why if you're a US person, it makes absolute sense to set up a US LLC. But if you're a non-US person, a European shareholder or member owner, then that means that your European company or your European founder now has to file US tax returns, which is usually an unappetizing outcome. And it also kind of defeats the purpose of setting up the US entity because you set it up to kind of ring fence your operations in the US. So the C corporation makes sense for cross-border structures. In addition to that, the C corporation is treated the same at the federal level and at the state level. So all of your tax compliance is ring fenced to that entity. As an LLC, which is a flow through, the founder or the European company may have to file US tax returns for federal purposes. And then for state purposes, the LLC would need to file certain returns because states have their own set of tax laws. And so I have one client who decided to go through with the LLC route because their third-party logistics provider told them you should set up a Florida-based LLC. And when I hear that, I'm like, why in God's name did you set up in Florida? Do you have any connection to Florida? And what? So now you've got this Florida LLC set up, and this client has the founder owns this LLC directly, so he doesn't have a UK company that owns it. So this founder's filing 1040 NRs every year in the US. That's a personal tax filing for a non-resident. That founder also has to file specific returns for the LLC at the federal level because of the cross-border nature. And the founder needs to file state LLC filings with Florida. So that's 3 levels of filing, which means I get to make money on this structure as a tax service provider, but it's not what the answer I would have given this founder had he come to me directly. So oftentimes when you're asking advice from people, would you ask for medical advice from your nutritionist? Probably not, right? You're going to talk to your doctor about the medical advice you need. So if you're thinking about setting up your structure, you should talk to a lawyer or a tax person instead of your third-party logistics provider, because those guys are going to know the holistic picture as to why you shouldn't be setting up the LLC, but you should be setting a C corporation. And to take this one step forward, C corporations have much more preferential treatment when it comes to repatriation, making dividend payments, because most countries will have a tax treaty with the United States, which means you can help bring profits back to the Europe or UK under the treaty at much preferential rates than if you were an individual that set up an LLC.
That makes total sense. So obviously we're in a world of tariffs now. Are there any implications on whether it's the timing or the structure as relates to tariffs?
This is a very relevant question that my clients and prospective companies are asking me now, because as of in 10 days from now, on the 29th of August, the $800 de minimis will be abolished. And that basically was, if you per person per day, you could have $800 worth of goods imported into the US with no customs or tariffs for most countries. And now in 10 days, that $800 threshold goes away, which means even the smallest amount of goods purchased from abroad coming into the US will be subject to 15% or more tariff. And a lot of companies are trying to figure out what they can do to now protect their margins, because when a good is hit with tariff, someone's going to have to pay for it. It's either going to be the brand or the customer. And so companies are asking me, what can we do to, number one, protect our margins, and number two, stay competitive in the US? And so the solution that most tax advisors are communicating is that you can set up a US entity. That US entity can now purchase these goods directly from the manufacturer, which means you would be importing goods into the US at a manufacturing cost price. Or your European company continues to buy all the stock from the manufacturer, but then imports it to your US entity at a wholesale price, so cost plus a markup, and then you pay tariffs at the wholesale price. So a 10-15% tariff at cost or at wholesale price is much lower, much lower than a tariff at retail price. And this strategy not only helps you decide whether you need to set up a US entity, what type of US entity you set up, but it takes it one step further, because you now have to figure out how you're going to maintain your customer base in the US maintain that loyalty and also protect your profit margin. Because I can tell you, I've lost track of how many times I've gone to shop for a good. I've had my checkout cart ready to go. And then I go online, Google, and I say, okay, this is the product I'm looking for. And I see that there's a $2 off discount or a 10% off discount that someone locally is offering. I will abandon my cart and go for the lower price. And so these non-US brands that rely heavily on the US market, which is the biggest market, consumer market in the world, need to stay competitive and need to be able to bring their goods in now at a lower price, because the days of drop shipping from Europe are now a thing of the past, because everything that's being dropped from Europe into the US will be subject to tariffs.
That is so smart. No, it makes it's very easy. The way you explained it makes it so easy to understand why you would want to form earlier, get that legal entity in place so that you could either buy direct or ship into at a much reduced wholesale rate. Makes total sense. This has been great, Sonia. It's so much good information. Is it okay with you if I share your contact details in the description below?
Yes, absolutely. And before we wrap up today, I have a little riddle. It's a silly little riddle for you. What do you think Spotify, IKEA, Adidas, and Stripe have in common?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. What?
All of these household names, these giant brands, every single one of them is based outside of headquartered outside of the US and expanded into the US. And every single one of them chose to set up a Delaware Inc. So these are the top of the top companies in their industries, and the industries are spread across different sectors. And all of them chose to set up a Delaware Inc. for their US expansion efforts. So next time a founder is saying, I heard, an LLC is a better structure, why don't you say, well, what about the top dogs in their own industries? What did they do, right? And they're paying for top-notch legal and tax advice. And if they're going the Delaware Inc. route, you must have a real good reason to be going against the grain there.
Well, and so many growth companies are seeking investment, and that, from what I understand, and I'm not an attorney or accountant, that even more favors having a Delaware C corp, because the investors like the specific laws in Delaware as relates to their protection.
Absolutely. A Delaware Inc. entity is the gold standard when it comes to VC funding or just raising funding in general. Everyone knows the laws of Delaware. Everyone knows it's a tax beneficial jurisdiction. And if you don't already have a Delaware Inc., more often than not, your investors will say you need to re-domicile to Delaware, or you need to do a flip into Delaware, or you need to set up a Delaware Inc. as your holding company. Otherwise, we're not interested.
This is fantastic. I can't wait for our next conversation, Sonia. Thanks so much for spending the time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.